Good evening and welcome everyone. My name is Bonnie Efros and I'm the Rothman Director of the Center for the Humanities and the Public Sphere here at the University of Florida. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this evening's lecture by Professor Nancy Folbre, which is the penultimate in our year-long series on the work of the humanities, critical thinking in life and labor. And we thought that, can you hear me now better? Push it closer? Okay. We thought that having an event here in Ustler Hall was very suited to the subject of this evening's lecture, and also just to give a plug for the Center for Women's Studies and Gender Research, which is housed here in the building. In the foyer, there's some brochures about their major and minor programs, as well as their graduate certificates. As those of you who've attended previous talks in our series know, that our speakers have each used the lens of the humanities, often integrated with other disciplines in the social sciences, engineering, business, and more, to explore the changing workplace and the effect of technology on all of our lives. Our invited scholars have suggested innovative ways to understand, adapt to, or in some cases challenge, fundamental changes in our day-to-day landscape, whether in the privacy of our homes, on the global stage of the internet, or in the rapidly shifting environment of workplaces. The global marketplace has created demands for new skill sets among employees and administrators, but it has likewise created challenges both to family life and our interaction with friends and coworkers. Each of our speakers in the series has demonstrated how humanities disciplines have valuable contributions to make to the culture of innovation and the associated uncertainty that it brings in all of our lives. They offer us examples of how to listen, analyze, argue, and negotiate these terrains, some more familiar and others less so. The humanities allow us to critique and enhance that experience, improve the quality of life and labor, and add value to the human experience in unexpected ways. Tonight's lecture by Professor Folbre examines how feminism has always reached beyond an emphasis on gender equality to interrogate the causes and consequences of inequality writ large. In recent years, the emergence of feminist social science has generated a distinctive approach to political economy that emphasizes the intersection of many different forms of collective identity and action, with important implications for the trajectory of our economic system. Growing attention to the economic importance of unpaid work within families and communities parallels in many respects attention to the other unpriced resources crucial to a sustainable environment. Feminist theory can help to construct a new paradigm for progressive political change. Before I finish introducing Professor Folbre this evening, I want to give brief thanks to the many people and organizations that have made tonight's event possible. I apologize to those of you who have been to previous lectures because it's quite a litany, but it shows the support that the series has had from the university. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Sophia Akerd and Professor Sean Adams, now chair of the History Department, who conceptualized the series, chose and invited speakers, found sponsors for these events, and organized many details related to the series. And to Tim Blanton and Sarah Harms in the Humanities Center, as well as the Class Shared Services Center for doing the legwork that makes all of these events possible. Our series is made possible by the Rothman Endowment and Yavits Fund of the Center for the Humanities and the Public Sphere in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, with co-sponsorship from the UF Informatics Institute, the Smathers Libraries, the Honors Program, the College of Public Health and Health Professions, the Department of Political Science, the Department of English, the Philip Wegner and Marston Milbauer Eminent Scholar Chair, the Department of Philosophy, the Department of Classics, the Elizabeth B. and William F. Coe Center for Business Ethics and Education and Research, the Albert Brick Professor, the Center for Women's Studies and Gender Research, the UF Research Computing, and the Graham Center. The next lecture, I just want to point out, in our series will occur on the 16th of April in the Pugh Hall of Cora, and this will be by Cynthia Farrar, and it's entitled Startup Democracy, Innovating Citizenship with the Ancient Athenians. And we've placed flyers about this, the sign-up sheet on the small table over to my left, so that you can get more information or get onto our mailing list. After tonight's lecture, there will be a Q&A. We'll also have a reception here, as you can see at the entrance to the room, so I hope that you'll be able to stay to the end. So it's always a great pleasure to see visits like today's come to fruition after long planning, and I'm very pleased to welcome our distinguished guest, Nancy Folbre, who is Professor Emerita of Economics at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Her vita is immense, so I will only mention a few of her most recent accomplishments. Much of her research has focused on the economic dimensions of care work and its impact on gender equality. She recently edited For Love and Money, Care Provision in the U.S., and she's authored many books, including most recently, Saving State U, Why We Must Fix Public Higher Education, and that was published in 2010. Greed, Lust, and Gender, A History of Economic Ideas, published in 2009. Valuing Children, Rethinking the Economics of the Family, published in 2008. Between 2009 and 2014, she was the weekly contributor to the New York Times economics blog, and she's held grants from the MacArthur Foundation, the Russell Sage Foundation, the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation, the National Science Foundation, just to name a few. So without further ado, I hope that you'll join me in welcoming Professor Nancy Folbre, who will speak this evening on Unpaid and Unpriced Toward a Feminist Political Economy.
Thank you so much, Bonnie, for that really kind introduction. I'm really happy to be here in Gainesville. As a women's basketball fan, I really love this space. My only criticism is I feel that there should be a hoop, and the speaker should have a free throw to start things off. What do you think? How am I without the mic? Can you live with that? It's for the video. This is for the video. This is for the room.
Yeah. You just want to kill it.
Okay.
There you go. Here's your clicker.
Oh, my clicker. Okay, great. What were we talking about? Oh, unpaid work. Yes, Bonnie's introduction, I think, did a really good job of explaining, giving a kind of overview of the kind of research I do on unpaid work. I think there are a lot of really interesting technical aspects of this research. It kind of challenges conventional national accounting conventions. It has a lot of policy implications. But I also think it's being kind of culturally negotiated in the U.S. today in a variety of ways. Maybe not directly or explicitly, but kind of implicitly. I think we're all aware of a kind of tension between the market and the rest of society, the market and the environment, the market and the family. And we're living through a period in which we're trying to figure out and sort out what the relationship between these different aspects of our social organization should be and could be. And I think this graffiti is kind of emblematic of that. It just sort of came out of nowhere, and I took a picture of it with my phone, and it turns out to be pretty, it resounds pretty clearly with the more academic work that I'm doing. So I'm going to have a few words on my slides, but I've really tried to make this talk a talk about the cultural negotiation that I think is going on and give you some indicators of the extent to which concern about these issues really extends beyond the academy per se, in ways I hope that you'll be able to connect with and help me myself connect better too. So I'm going to start out just telling you what I mean by care as a concept, explaining what is meant by the term the care penalty, which is basically just what it sounds like, a kind of economic cost to people who take on commitments to care, whether unpaid or paid. How this relates to gender and gender roles and how this is changing over time, because I think it is changing in some very significant ways. Very briefly about accounting for care, how we go about using some tools of economic analysis and research to get a grip on it. And then finally, maybe a few comments about public policy. So every talk that I give, I show this slide. It's a visual image that was designed by the Red Women's Collective in London in the 1970s. And of course, what they intended by it was the importance of bringing unpaid work in the home into the foreground and seeing it as part of the economy as a whole. The economy is not just about the factory or about the production of goods. It's also about the production and the reproduction of the people that go into those goods. So in a conventional economics text, there's always a picture of the circular flow, but it never really unpacks what's going on inside the household. And in this talk, I'm going to try to unpack that a little bit and really bring it to the fore. So in every culture, there's a link between thinking about mothers, fathers, the family, and thinking about nature. And of course, in our tradition, Western tradition, we talk about Mother Nature as kind of a pretty common trope. But it's also true in Korea, and this is a picture of a Korean spirit of nature that I think has a very feminine aspect. And I found it came across it at a women's conference, and I liked that idea that there was some cross-cultural resonance to that connection. And of course, a big part of the connection is that a lot of the services that nature provides are indispensable to economic success, but they're unpriced and unpaid. And likewise, the work that families do in taking care of one another is generally unpriced and unpaid, but it's nonetheless really economically significant. So there's a picture of me being cared for, age 6, little personal history there, and maybe influencing the way I came to think about care work. I define care work as work where concern for the well-being of the care recipient is likely to affect the quality of the service provided. That's very different from a standard model of impersonal exchange. Putting $1.50 into a Coke machine, that's an impersonal exchange, right? Teaching, nursing, childcare, elder care, a lot of social services. People are often on a first-name basis. They're often hands-on. They're touching each other. The relationship is often really important to the well-being of the care recipient, and it's very personal. In that sense, it doesn't really fit easily into the logic of the market. So what this definition allows is or encourages, I think, is a perspective on care work that's not just confined to the home, to unpaid work in the home, but allows us to see some very important similarities between the unpaid work in the home that is, of course, very personal and very emotional, and a lot of forms of paid work, which also, maybe not to the same degree, but often have elements of that kind of personal exchange. So interactive care work can be done by men or women. It can be done for pay or not explicitly for pay. And interactive care work involves this face-to-face dimension. There's also a lot of what I call support care work that makes that face-to-face interaction possible. In order to feed somebody dinner, you have to go shopping, you have to prepare the food. That's often kind of integrated into a larger process of service delivery that has this component of care labor. So it seems like a pretty simple definition, but it actually has some pretty momentous implications for the way you think about pay and the way you think about performance and the way you think about contribution to overall economic output and consumption. So here are some common characteristics of paid and unpaid care. It's pretty hard to measure the output, the value of what is produced, because it's hard to see just exactly what your impact was. It's hard for a teacher to see, how much exactly did I improve your future productivity? How much exactly is this lecture going to contribute to your understanding of yourself and your environment? The benefits, I think, are kind of diffuse. Hopefully, whatever you learn here, you talk to other people, it affects what you do elsewhere, it spills over. There are these externalities, as economists put it, that make the benefits of education kind of very important, but very diffuse, difficult to pin down. Same thing about health. When you're healthier, your family is healthier, your neighborhood is healthier. You can't really reduce the output of a care transaction to the benefits to one person alone who's the beneficiary. I mean, obviously, sometimes you can, and obviously that's the most important one, but there are often these spillover effects. Lack of consumer sovereignty is kind of a fancy term that economists use for you often don't choose your caregiver. If you're a 3-year-old, you can't fire your nanny. right? If you're in a nursing home, you can't fire the person who's coming in to take care of you. Your choice is limited. It doesn't conform to the traditional characteristics of a market in that respect. It's often paid for by a third party. Your insurance company is paying the bill, or your parents are paying the bill, or the state of Florida is paying the bill. So you're not really, it's not like a market exchange where you're the shopper, and if you don't like it, you can go, buy it elsewhere. And that, by the way, is one of the reasons why it's so important that the caregiver have some concern for the well-being of the care recipient, because that caregiver often can't be fired, and it's very difficult to monitor the performance of that caregiver. So if you're going to hire somebody to take care of your baby or your parents, you want to find somebody who you think likes your baby and likes your mama, right? Because that's going to be a really important insurance, right, against the possibility that they'll do something that is not so great. So that is a really important element that kind of contributes, that concern for the well-being of the care recipient contributes to the quality of care services in a very significant way. Unfortunately, while it's very good for consumers, it's not so good for the care provider. Why is that? Well, the care provider, in a sense, is held hostage by their concern for the well-being of the person they're taking care of, right? You can't just, your baby's driving you crazy. Guess what? You can't lock them up in the closet and walk out the door. You have a responsibility. You have an obligation. If you take on responsibility for a family member who's sick, yeah, you can try to negotiate with your family members, but if nobody else is willing to provide that care, you're often in the position that you're going to have to provide it because it has to be provided and nobody else is going to do it, right? Similarly, in a lot of paid care work, teachers, nurses often have difficulty threatening to leave their job unless they're paid more, although they are unionized and there is some collective bargaining. They're more limited in that respect. If you look at ethnographies of childcare workers, a lot of them say, oh, I earn terrible wages, but I don't want to ask for any more because the parents can't afford to pay. Okay, how many workers have that attitude towards their own pay increases? Not very many. And it turns out, the real challenge to organizing childcare workers is getting them to, encouraging them to understand that if they ask for higher pay, they can stay on the job longer and reduce turnover and improve the quality of the services that they're going to provide. So these kind of aspects of care itself are linked to a pay penalty. And in our society, as in most societies around the world, care is considered predominantly a female responsibility, although that's beginning to change for reasons I'll explore. But a lot of the economic differences that we see today between men and women are linked in one way or another to women's greater tendency to take on obligations or responsibilities for care. So I'll give you some examples. You probably know this. If you take time out of paid employment to stay home with a baby, you not only sacrifice wages, but you sacrifice future career potential and lower your lifetime earnings in a very significant way. That penalty for taking time out really adds up to a significant amount of money. In the U.S. today, young women who are not married and do not have children earn almost exactly the same as young men with the same educational credentials. There is no pay difference. On the other hand, there's a huge pay difference between women who have children and women who don't have children. So in a sense, this care penalty is not just about gender. In a society now in which motherhood and family responsibilities are much more voluntary than they used to be, this division, this care penalty affects economic differences among women as well as between men and women, and also between different groups of men in some pretty significant ways. So understanding how the norms of care and norms of gender are evolving is really important to understanding economic outcomes. So Bonnie mentioned this book, and I just wanted to refer you to it. It's an edited volume, but it's a very it's not just a collection of essays. It's actually pretty. It's a pretty coherent discussion of theoretical issues, empirical issues of unpaid care, empirical issues of paid care, and policy issues about care work in the United States. So if I've piqued your curiosity about some of these empirical findings, or you want to know more about exactly how big the pay penalty is, or exactly how much more unpaid work than women do, and you can, I want to just refer you to that and tell you that you can probably find almost any number that you want related to the organization of care work here. So, who is taking care of you? Well, this is an example of what I mean by kind of cultural negotiation and anxiety. This is actually a key card for the Sheraton Hotel. And why would the Sheraton Hotel ask who's taking care of you? It's because they want to imply that they're taking care of you and that they're not just in the business of making money on you as a hotel client, but they care about you personally. You're going to provide really good service. And maybe that promise is fulfilled to some extent. But on the other hand, it's in many respects a kind of advertising ploy that's used increasingly frequently in a lot of different places. Like, I don't know if you've noticed this, but there used to be customer service departments that you could go to if you had a complaint. And in many cases now they're called customer care, right? And advertising slogans like, we care about you more, we care about you completely, all those phrases have been trademarked. And legally, you're really not, technically not supposed to use them without paying a royalty because they've become, kind of privatized as part of modern discourse. So, of course, the gendered dimension of care and the idea that femininity itself is really related to care is kind of historically very much related to the vision of maternal responsibility. And in the Western Judeo, but especially Christian tradition, it's the relationship of the Madonna and the child that represents the iconic portrayal of this, most fundamental of human relationships, most caring of human relationships. And I love, this is a piece of street art from Florence that somebody, some aspiring artist, who came out of the museum and just took it, and I thought did a really nice job of kind of modernizing the image, and that's why I liked it. But this image it's really gotten extended and kind of Baudelarized in really interesting ways. This is a very famous advertisement for British Airways. It's old. It's from the 1980s, but it's such a classic. And I think it's actually a very funny image, right? It's the stewardess is treating a first-class business passenger like an infant. And of course, this is a promise of really genuine care. And it's funny because it's also a little bit of an infantilizing the old guy and making it pretty clear that he's basically just a big baby. So it has this sort of double meaning that I like, but it came into play in a lot of discussions about the job of a stewardess. There's been a lot of interesting research about training of stewardesses, and one of the things that they're really trained to do and really required to do on the job is smile and be really friendly and be really loving and really make you feel cared for, because it turns out that's kind of a fundamental human desire, especially in a slightly alien and slightly scary environment. So a lot of jobs that involve care sort of really require, if not genuine emotional connection, often the performance of some reassuring performance of some interpersonal connection. And the stewardess is kind of the representation of that. Of course, the image of the housewife and the idealization of the housewife is really kind of part of our image of 1950s America, and there are a lot of really great images from 1950s magazines and cookbooks that are funky and funny. But there's also this series of versions of the film The Stepford Wives. I don't know if you've seen the original version or the remake. They're both very funny satires on the kind of programming of women to provide domestic services. And I think that's a really good example of a kind of cultural effort to challenge the idea that that what men want, what the men of Stepford want, is wives who are literally robots, who will make the desserts and keep the house clean and shut up about everything else. And as you know from the movie, there's some really interesting and pretty subversive little angles that come up in that discourse. In a lot of modern film, and I'm sure you can think of some other examples. I just want to kind of prime your imagination here. The image of the successful women, increasingly in modern film, has come to resemble the image of a very powerful man with a lot of physical prowess. And this is Uma Thurman in Kill Bill is a really good example. She, it's kind of in my view, kind of a classic of American cinema. Although I'm not a huge Quentin Tarantino fan, but I like this film. And she's inspired by, in the series, by her love for her daughter. So there's this maternal thing. But like about 1% of the film footage actually includes her daughter. Most of the time she's kicking the shit out of her baby's father, who has tried to kill her and steal her baby. And it's really a story about how a woman can be just as good at the martial arts as a man, and still be incredibly beautiful and sexy as Uma Thurman is. So there is a real, what you're seeing here is an example of a reconfiguration of femininity and kind of sexualizing a more androgynous and a more kind of masculinized version of the feminine. And Buffy the Vampire Slayer is another example. Buffy does not babysit. Buffy slays vampires. Now, she does have, there are always Buffy fans in the audience. Buffy does have a younger sister. There are a few episodes where Buffy has to kind of pay attention to her younger sister. But in general, Buffy is unencumbered by care responsibilities. I hope, you agree? Okay. Now, and Xena, the warrior princess, okay, not everybody. Xena isn't as well known as Buffy. But Lucy Lawless, really nice Australian actress. I think she's a really interesting figure. Xena is kind of the feudal version of Buffy. So she inhabits this, medieval environment where there are not vampires and werewolves, but there are monsters and invading armies and evil wizards and stuff like that. And so I want to tell you a story about Xena that I learned from an audience. I never, I have not honestly watched every episode of Buffy or Xena. But apparently the producers of Xena, the Warrior Princess, wanted to appeal to an earlier demographic, a younger demographic. Their advertisers wanted them to appeal to an earlier demographic. So they wanted Xena to have a baby. They thought that would be really good for their advertising revenue. But they had this really serious problem. How could Xena have a baby and continue to basically fight and kill evil wizards, warriors, and monsters? Solution. Xena gives birth to her baby, is immediately frozen in ice for 20 years by an evil wizard. The series skips 20 years ahead, and her daughter, who has been cared for by other members of the community, is by her side as she emerges from the ice and can fight again. Okay, not a solution available to most young mothers, right? But an example of how the effort to reconfigure femininity in a way that's less encumbered by obligation to care for dependents actually requires either a serious flight of imagination or some pretty significant public policy, and that's kind of the gist of it. So meanwhile, we've also seen a lot of efforts to renegotiate men's responsibility and men's roles. And I think that's proceeding in a pretty significant, although very kind of slow way. Empirically, we know that married men are now devoting more time to housework than they used to, more time to childcare than they used to. Unfortunately, a lot of men are not married and are not living with their children. So what we're seeing is kind of a polarization of masculinity. Some are really good dads. Instead of having a lot of men who were mostly dads who didn't do a lot of dad activity, right? Now what we see is a world where there's a bunch of men who have nothing to do with women or children and may have children, but they're on another continent, right? And then on the other hand, the men, the married, good dads who spend a lot of time, sharing care responsibilities with their parents. This is a cover of Fortune magazine. It's pretty early, like around 2000, and I think it's a very negative image. And I think it's an example of Fortune taking a very condescending attitude towards women CEOs who had a stay-at-home husband. So this just seems transparent to me that it's condescending. The guy looks kind of frumpy. Why does he have an apron on? That seems unnecessary. He has kind of a dumb look on his face. This is, I think, kind of a very ironic image. So who's behind every powerful woman? A really kind of not very attractive guy who's taking care of the kids, but how could it possibly be worth it to be a CEO if you had to go home to this? I mean, isn't there a little bit of that in that image? Okay, now let me show you a much more modern image that shows some really significant, in my view, you may not agree, I think it shows some cultural evolution. Pretty good looking dude, You don't have to see his face, He's got nice lats. Is that what those are? I don't know exactly what those are. I mean, like, he's not like super macho, but he's strong, right? He's strong, And there's the baby, like, there is Newsweek saying the traditional male is an endangered species. It's time to rethink masculinity. And we are rethinking it in a lot of ways. But we haven't quite made up our minds yet about it. I think there's still a lot of angst and a lot of ambivalence about it. But it's an example to me of how the changing care economy requires a kind of change in the gender economy, and vice versa, that changes in gender roles require some rethinking about care responsibility. So I don't want to make any more profound claims than that, but I think just the two things are related. So now, let me move on to just talking about how economists and social scientists try to get a quantitative grip on work that's unpaid and not really valued in the market economy. I know it seems like kind of a contradiction in terms, because we think of accounting as a very impersonal, objective, number crunching, green eye shade, just write down the numbers, put them into the adding machine. And I've just been telling you that care doesn't fit the image of a traditional exchange. So there's a little conceptual tension here, and I want to be the first to acknowledge that. So this process of accounting for care is going to be kind of tricky and maybe even risky, right? But I think it's really worth it, and I want to see if I can persuade you of it. So how do we go about it? Well, the main instrument that social scientists use is a time-use survey. Have any of you ever heard of a time-use survey or done a time-use survey? So, like, somebody might call you up from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and ask you to participate, and if you agree, they would make a phone appointment with you, and this is what it would go. This is how it would go. What time did you get up yesterday? What did you do? What else did you do? What was the next thing that you did? When you stopped doing that, what did you do? So respondents actually say, okay, I got up, I went to the bathroom, I took a shower, I took the dog for a walk, I cooked breakfast, and those responses are then coded into a set of categories. It's a pretty extensive list of categories, but it's kind of, the responses are shoehorned into that set of categories. And it includes not just what activity you were engaging in, but also were there any children under the age of 12 in your care while you were doing this? Because you could be in the shower and still be keeping an ear out for a toddler in the next room. You could be cooking dinner in the kitchen and know that your kids were in the living room. And it may be that the reason that you're home is not that you need to cook dinner, but that you need to be there to supervise the kids, and that's why you're cooking at home, right? And the time use survey basically allows you to see some of the connections between different activities and different temporal constraints, the different, the sort of the temporal organization of your day. And in these time use surveys, which have been around for a long time, but have recently, over the last 10 years, become increasingly sophisticated and are conducted by a very large number of countries. I think last year about 84 countries conducted a nationally representative time use survey. They basically designate work anything that you could, in principle, pay somebody else to do for you. So, cooking dinner, you could pay somebody to do it. That's work. Shopping, you could pay somebody to do that. That's work. Taking care of your children, you could pay somebody to do that, so that's considered work, and so forth and so on. Often, time spent in transportation is assigned to the activity for which the transportation is intended. So, driving to your paid job is generally counted as part of your paid work day, and driving to take your children to the child care center would be considered a care activity. Actually, it turns out that, I think this is a very interesting aside, like the third biggest component of childcare time is driving children various places. Yeah, in the U.S. This is basically the U.S. that I'm talking about. But this time, but enough of that. Let's look at a time use survey for another country. This is not the U.S. Let me tell you what this graph is. I mean, it's a pretty picture, which is why I like to show it. But it's also really interesting. It's called a tempogram. And what it's showing is the percentage of people engaged in the designated activity at different hours of the day. So it starts at 4 a.m., and the blue area represents the percentage of people who were asleep. So as the day proceeds, from 4 a.m. To 4 a.m., what you see is that people are gradually waking up. So the blue area is dwindling. So almost by 11 a.m., almost everybody is awake. And the green area there is household work. So people are getting up and they're preparing breakfast, and they're taking care of the kids, and they're doing housework. And the red area is paid work, so that's the percentage of people who are engaged in paid work. And then that white area is time spent eating. We don't normally count that as work. You can't pay somebody to eat for you, so it's not work. Okay, so what jumps out at you from this graph, if anything? The yellow is the free time, the gray is the TV and video time. But for my purposes, what's really interesting is that the red area is about the same size as the green area. And that is what time use surveys in every country show. The amount of time devoted to unpaid work is approximately equal to the amount of time devoted to paid work. And we're talking about very developed countries here, the US, France, Norway, Sweden. And part of the reason for that is that students are not working for pay, for the most part. Retired people are not working for pay, for the most part. And even people who are working for pay 8 hours a day during the week are doing a lot of unpaid work at night and on the weekends, right? So it turns out only about half the work that people do is actually counted as a contribution to gross domestic product, and the rest is basically ignored. And that's the most obvious reason why we should be counting it and asking what it's worth. But I'm also really interested in that white area, because you can see in this graph, you can pretty much tell it's not for the US, because people in the US don't take off a lot of time for lunch, and a lot of people don't take off a lot of time for dinner. This is actually time use data for Italy. Shows you what a good quality of life. Taking a long, leisurely lunch, then going back to work, and then having a leisurely late dinner. So I think it's kind of, I like that word tempogram. It's kind of taking a picture of the metabolic structure of a whole system in terms of when it's coming to life and when the system as a whole is taking care of itself and when it's going to sleep. So I'm irrationally fond of it. I spent a huge amount of time with the really boring numbers behind it, so that's. Yeah, it's old. It's from the Harmonized European Time Use Survey, and it's I think it's probably 1999. So it's old. It would be really neat to do it for the U.S. I've often thought it would be interesting to do other things. Like, I'm really interested in things like time spent searching for lost keys. That'd be interesting as you age over time. There are a lot of interesting things you could do, you know. And the American Time Use Survey is very disaggregated. It's got a lot of cool stuff in it. In fact, now it's used a lot for trying to understand the relationship between food and exercise and obesity. So there's a subsample that looks at how the number of times a person eats during the day and how much time they spend eating. Is that related to the amount of time they spend doing exercise? And how does that relate to health outcomes? So I think that's another really interesting example of kind of a health, a really interesting health perspective to the time use. There's also, psychologists use time use studies to see what makes people feel good. So instead of filling out a diary, what they do is they give people a beeper that's programmed to go off randomly, although you can turn it off at night. And there's certain private activities that you don't have to report. But if you're participating in the study, you're basically getting paid to, whenever the beeper goes off, to fill out a form that is, a little survey that's on the programmed into the device, and it asks you things like, how good do you feel? How stressed do you feel? Do you feel depressed? It monitors people's states of mind. And of course, there's a lot of interest now in happiness. What determines happiness? What determines mood during the day? And I think it's a very interesting instrument for trying to get at the subjective dimensions of people's experienced life. I don't know, like one example, of course I remember this because this is what every academic in their heart believes to be true, that people report about the same level of happiness when they're reading a book and watching a movie, but the effect of reading a book lasts much longer, has a positive effect that persists, whereas the effect of watching a TV show or a movie ends when the TV or movie is over. So it's actually reading a book is better, it will make you happier longer, which I think, I'm not absolutely persuaded that's true, but wouldn't it be nice for people who write books if that were true? So the time use survey is a really great instrument, and we can talk more about the details if you're interested. So you end up with a bunch of numbers for every individual, and you can ask how their age, their gender, their household structure, the region of the country they live in, there are a lot of variables you can use to predict their time use. And then you can ask, how much would it cost to pay somebody to do the same work at prevailing rates? And you can take a pretty crude estimate of a wage rate, like for a lot of activities, like let's say babysitting or just supervising children, the minimum wage seems like a reasonable estimate. For other activities like reading aloud to a child or helping a child with homework, a higher wage seems like if you were going to replace that time, you would hire somebody with some education to do the work. So maybe a kindergarten teacher's wage would be a replacement cost. It's a lower bound estimate. It doesn't purport to be a measure of the true value of what family members are providing, but it's a kind of lower bound. It's got to be worth at least this much. If a family member was not able to provide it, what would it cost you to provide it? So then you can take this and ask, what does this add up to as a percentage of gross domestic product? It adds up to about a third to a half. Why is it sometimes less than a half? Because you're using a really low wage rate, right? It's half of all the work that's done, but being conservative and trying to be cautious about imputing its value, you can end up with it being about a third of the value of market GDP. And so if you, you could alter, you can redefine your measure of total income, the total value of goods and services produced in the U.S. by adding gross domestic product, which is goods and services that are bought and sold, adding in the replacement cost valuation of the non-market work that is done. So sometimes people get very, very nervous about this idea. Sometimes people get very nervous. Let me start over. There's a tremendous amount of resistance to actually changing the national income accounts to include this valuation. And I'm very interested in the causes of this resistance, and my full-time job basically is trying to overcome it. And so that's one reason I am here talking with you, getting some ideas about how to make the argument, advance the argument, and persuade national statistical offices to do it more. But a really key part of this argument is that the current value of gross domestic product, which is like one of the most, if you think about, like if you did a word count or a word cloud, you know how you can do, there's software that allows you to do a word cloud that where the size of the word reflects the number of times the word appeared in like the New York Times or in media. GDP is a big word, right? Does everybody agree with me about that? Yeah. So it's actually really, really important, and it's like whoever has the biggest GDP is winning, right? So the U.S. has a really big GDP per capita, so that means that U.S. economic policies must be really good, right? It's a little bit of a scorecard in a larger policy debate, which is why it's really important. But GDP actually includes a lot of very approximate measures that, in my view, are actually more approximate than the estimates of the value of unpaid household work. And one of those that's particularly relevant to developing countries is the value of subsistence production of food and the value of water and fuel that are gathered from the local area but require a lot of time to bring in. So technically, these activities, like if you have a dairy cow, a household survey should estimate how much milk you're getting from that dairy cow, what that milk would cost if you bought it on the market, and that is added, in principle, according to national accounting principles, that should be part of the household's income. And likewise, if you spent a lot of time carrying a large load of firewood, you could ask, what would it cost if you purchased that firewood, or if you hired somebody to bring that firewood? That is within what the system of national accounts calls the production boundary. In principle, it should be included. In practice, it is not very well measured. And I think that's can be a really serious problem, especially since it's probably a lot of that subsistence production is going down even as market income is going up. So if you're only counting the market income in an area that, say, switched to cash crop production, you're probably overstating their well-being because you haven't measured the decline in the production of foodstuffs for their own use. But that's kind of an empirical question. I mention it mostly because I know some of you here are interested in development and do field work and could actually kind of plug into that debate about the value of subsistence production. But what I'm interested in is that the system of national accounts that most countries use for this accounting procedure explicitly excludes services produced in the household. So it's only goods that are produced. But it turns out, I mean, actually it's kind of hard. What is the difference between a good and a service, right? Well, from their point of view, cooking a meal is a service, not a good. But in some countries, baking bread is considered a good rather than a service because you can do it ahead of time. But in some countries, it's not. I think that's a little bit weird. But the biggest exception, which I find really telling, is that the value of breast milk is totally ignored. And yet breast milk, we know from medical and epidemiological studies is a really important contributor to the health and well-being of infants, particularly under the age of 6 months, right? And yes, it's a service, but it's also a good, right? It's milk. And you're counting the cow's milk. You're asking, what is the value of the cow's milk? But you're completely ignoring the value of breast milk. Well, you'd think, last August I was in Rotterdam at a National Income Accounts meeting, and I was making this point kind of feebly. Have you thought about this? And often the response is, oh, that can't possibly be very important. There are not that many children, and there are not that many mothers breastfeeding, and they don't really breastfeed for that long. Well, there's this really interesting economist, feminist economist, Julie Smith, who actually looked at the numbers for Australia. And it's not that hard to estimate, because you have surveys that tell you how many children under the age of 6 months are in Australia, and you have health surveys that tell you what percentage of them are nursing. And you have figures on the average amount of milk that is produced by a nursing mother. It doesn't really vary all that much in terms of ounces per week, right? And you have a market price, because hospitals buy and sell breast milk for the special care of premature babies and babies who need assistance. So it's not a very thick market, but there is a market. So this is not rocket science, like number of babies, ounces of milk, price per ounce, 1% of the GDP of Australia is the value of breast milk. 1%, a really big number. That's a lot. But of course, what really interests me is the symbolic, what's the right word? Grossness of this, of disregarding this really important contribution to the health and well-being of the next generation. So that if you go into a country and you start marketing formula, Nestle's infant formula, you can boost GDP, because the sale of infant formula counts, and the reduction in breast milk production is completely ignored. So it's just like, it's exactly like GDP going up because of an oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, right? Where all the money that you spend cleaning it up increases the value of GDP. I mean, it's a really perverse, it's a seriously perverse result. Okay, a less interesting example, but maybe perhaps a larger percentage, actually about 13% of GDP in the US, is that imputations are made for the value of owner-occupied housing. So when somebody pays rent, that payment of rent goes into GDP. That's the purchase of a housing service. But if you own your own home, you don't pay rent. This could make countries where a lot of people own their homes look like they're not as successful as countries where people are renting, right? So we don't want that. So what we'll do is we'll ask, what is the average home price in this neighborhood? And then we'll say, let's call 6% of the average home price the imputed rent that you would have to pay if you were renting it. That's pretty approximate, right? I mean, that's 6% number. It's pretty approximate. It's way more approximate than the valuation of non-market work. And yet, that's a routine part of the published figures for gross domestic product. Now, in the US, now in Europe, the European Statistical Agency, Eurostat, has mandated that the value of illegal activities, including prostitution, must be included in GDP. For years it was excluded because, how would you measure it? Because obviously, by definition, nobody wants you to know, right? But they worried that this was actually misrepresenting the level of economic activity. And Italy first took this plunge, more than 15 years ago. They decided to do it, and it boosted Italian GDP significantly. Suddenly, Italy had a higher GDP than the UK, right? So now Eurostat has mandated the inclusion of these, the inclusion of an estimate of the value of these activities. So often, let me just say, often you don't really know how statistical offices make these calculations. And you're not going to find them in an academic journal, and you're not going to find them on the web. And, maybe they're in some archive somewhere, but pretty much it's often really hard to figure it out. Like for me to figure out, like, how do they actually impute the value of owner-occupied housing? I had to like call a lot of people, a lot of experts, and really follow a trail to figure it out. But it turns out that the UK Statistical Office actually published online its method for estimating the value of prostitute services in the UK. And it's a shockingly crude estimate. I mean, it's like, you know, surveys indicate that there are X number of prostitutes in London, and if we assume that they engage in 5 transactions per day, and each transaction is worth, you know, £50, then that gives us a value of London of this amount, and then we extrapolate for the UK as a whole, prorating the extent of prostitution by the distance from urban areas. I mean, you know, it's just like this gobbledygook that you think, well, okay, good try. I mean, yes, I like it that you're trying to measure something that's difficult to measure, but then to say that you can't measure, you shouldn't include in the value of GDP the unpaid work that families are providing for themselves, I think is actually pretty shocking. So I won't go any further. So sometimes people, I promised I would address this issue, and I will just very briefly. They worry that putting a money value on something that shouldn't be reduced to dollars, and I think that's a really important risk, that you have to be mindful of it. I just don't think it should prevent us from doing it. There's a really interesting work by sociologist Viviana Zelizer, who talks about the hostile worlds hypothesis. The hostile worlds hypothesis kind of, like if you introduce family values into the world of business, American capitalism will fall apart. Not true, in my opinion. And if you introduce money concepts and money accounting into the home will actually collapse. The idea that you have to use a different logic for those different realms, or somehow they'll contaminate each other, I think is really false. If you think about it, most care does involve love, but it also involves money. Most people who stay home and take care of family members get a share of another family member's market income. There's some reciprocity. There's some money that it's not on an hour-per-hour basis, but there's an overlap between these worlds. So it's not really unpaid work. It's just paid as part of a partnership rather than on a wage, as part of a wage basis. So that's another reason I think to pay attention to it. So, okay, you've already figured this out. So I don't like this separate spheres, hostile thing. I think it's really important to overcome it. I just want to show you a couple more slides that show you why I think this is also important to the bigger picture of understanding what's going on in terms of the welfare state and the role of the welfare state. This is a video game. I don't think it's even a very good video game, but it's an interesting video game that I think shows you kind of how masculinity and capitalism are linked. The young guy, he's sexy, he's cute, he's rich, and you can play the game of money, power, and wealth. In general, the market economy is kind of often associated with what we think of as masculine values, whereas, look at this album for The Clash, kind of the opposite extreme. The welfare state, often women, children. Have you heard the term nanny state? Yeah. So the welfare state is kind of this unproductive, the dependence. They're dragging the economy down. It's not really a contribution. That's kind of the visual subtext behind these images. And here's one that I really love. Right? It's actually from the British magazine The Economist, describing the welfare state as a pregnant, I'm not quite sure, sort of androgynous figure, but clearly pregnant, right? And what the welfare state is cutting the baby out, that it needs to be cut. We need to cut the budget. This is unproductive spending. It's slowing us down. We're not able to keep up with the guys. If we have all these kids and take care of all these kids, we're not going to be able to take care of the guys. And I think that's actually a big part of the rhetoric of public spending. And I just offer it to you as an example of why it's really important to argue that taking care of people, even if it's unpaid, is a really economically productive activity. So obviously, I don't have time to tell you, to provide a solution to all these problems, but I'm just going to leave you with this claim that this is why accounting for care is important, is it can help us negotiate these issues about who's paying for the cost of dependence and how should we be paying for them. And I'm sure there are a lot of differences of opinion in the room about how much we should provide public support, how much private, how much women should do, how much men should do. There will always be differences, but if we don't actually know what the numbers look like and what these things are cost and how they fit in with the rest of the economy, it's a lot harder to have a good argument about it. So, thank you very much. I hope you have some comments and some questions. Yes.
Am I the only person?
Yes, stand up and be loud. Stand up and be loud.
Hi, well, I am not an academic. I'm a political activist. And I think that, and specifically a feminist one, and I've been involved in organizing women, basically, to change things for about 50 years, and we've seen some progress. I think that your accounting is very helpful in terms of, I mean, at one point during the Clinton administration, he said, "We're not for bean counting," and that was about how many women in each job, what percentage of women were in fields, I think. But in terms of feminism, I've often felt we are for bean counting, not only in that, but in
keeping track.
Housework, child care, all of that. But I think that when you get down to it, the main source of change for all these 50 years has been feminist mobilization.
Yeah.
Not, and that this kind of research can help the feminist mobilization, but I'm not sure it can change the people at the top if it's not accompanied by feminist mobilization.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah.
So anyway, along those lines, I've been particularly interested in this GDP figure that you're talking about, because in Red Stockings, the group that I work with, we've been stressing the contrast between the situation in the United States for women, where we have no nanny state at all, really, or barely any, and in Western Europe, for instance, the women there have much more social support and everything, child care, et cetera, et cetera. So we've been trying to say that one of the major obstacles to change here is that people have no idea that it's so much better elsewhere. And that if people knew how much better it was in Western Europe, and really began to believe it, we'd get outraged and really get up in arms and make sure that it got changed. But anyway, the point here with GDP is one of the myths of America, that's what we call it, the myth of America strategy, to wake people up to the myth of America, is that we're the richest country in the world. And we may have been, in terms of, to me, what the richest country in the world has always used to mean when I believed it, was that we had the highest standard of living, not that we had the highest GDP.
Yeah.
Because our standard of living has been going down now for at least 50 years, really, much longer than people realize. In 1968, the minimum wage was much higher than it is today. So when you take inflation into account. So it seems to me that this standard we're talking about, where the GDP is so important.
Yeah, it could help.
The real thing is our standard of living. And, how much work do you have to do to get a certain income that can pay for things we need, things like that. So how did this GDP, that really has to be attacked, not only from this feminist angle.
Well, it's also, I guess I want to emphasize, you don't want to completely rely on, even on an extended measure of GDP. I think you want a dashboard of standard of living indicators that include things like life expectancy and educational attainment. And, I think there's a big...
Life expectancy is 49th in the world.
Yeah, it's very poor.
How can they call that the richest country in the world?
That's right. Well, because they're playing a game. It's like the video game, And the game is, the winner is, get the highest GDP. And it is a little discouraging, but I think there's a lot of work going on, and a lot of public awareness now of the disjuncture between GDP and living standards. And the whole discussion of inequality, I think is a very good example of that. So I think I think there's a good, I think there's some good synergies between research that's happening and activism around these issues. And hopefully, we can make that continue and burgeon and thrive. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm wondering what kinds of policies would that visibility support, especially the distributive policies from wage.
Okay, well, it would mean that the poverty line for a working mother should be higher because she has more expenses. Right now, the poverty line is literally insensitive to whether somebody has a full-time job or not. But clearly, if you have a full-time job, you have more costs, expenses. So that's a really big thing. A lot of income-tested programs, like the Children's Health Insurance Program or Medicaid, are all linked to that poverty line. So you could, if you change the poverty line so that you need, to acknowledge that you need more income if you're working full-time for pay, it would dramatically expand access to current social services. I mean, I think it would also start a big debate in other areas. I'm not sure, how exactly it would shake out, but it would completely modify the whole structure of targeted social assistance. Yeah.
I saw a study once, and I don't know if it's true. It was on the relationship of marriage to life expectancy.
Yeah.
And it showed that married women do not live as long as single women, but married men live longer than single men. And if that's true, which I don't know it is, it was one study, is there hazard pay factored into these conversations?
No, that's a really good point, and that's actually somebody was at a potluck dinner we had last night. Somebody raised the issue that the health risks of motherhood are also pretty significant and often pretty persistent. So really, that should be, somehow that belongs in the equation too. Yeah, yeah. So I don't mean, I don't think that the valuation of unpaid work or of these more narrowly economic terms doesn't really solve the whole problem. It just happens to be it's my particular, it's my particular little, it's my little fight. Because I think there's potential now. I think there's actually, it's partly because I think there's a lot of momentum and activism to support it. I think it's an opportune time to dislodge the orthodoxy about it now, and that could help facilitate research in other areas. Yeah. Oh yeah, it's an old one. Yeah.
You have some really great suggestions for policy.
I'm wondering. I can't even remember.
Because yes, I think you're right. We need to calculate the work the unpaid work that's going on, all of the bill paying and second childcare.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm also a feminist organizer with Kathy Sarah Child and the Women's Liberation Movement. But you have these terrific demands, like pretty much national health care, full child care, family labor. Elimination of bias about tying things to marriage or benefits.
Yeah.
So I guess I just wanted to push back a little bit on this, so we get it out of the GPD. Like these are much more exciting to me about mobilizing.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I hear you, and I do work on a lot of policy issues about paid family leave and sick leave, and try to.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I think that obviously. Working on the federal level has been very frustrating, and so a lot of energy has moved to the state level. And what we're seeing is some really interesting success stories, both with paid family leave and sick leave and early childhood education. And I think we're learning from that experience and trying to expand the list of states that provide paid family leave. So right now, there's a big debate in New York State and a lot of pressure on Governor Cuomo to implement a paid family leave for New York State that would add New York to the current list that includes California, New Jersey, and I think it's Rhode Island. And sick leave in Massachusetts, I worked on the sick leave, paid sick leave referendum on the state level, and it's really hard to get any progressive things passed through referendum in Massachusetts. And I can't tell you how many failed referendum projects. And as you know, as you may have noticed, we elected a pretty conservative governor, but the paid sick leave referendum passed. There is tremendous public support, as there is public support for increasing the minimum wage. And it's really interesting. I mean, the Americans are really very, very exercised about this issue of supporting family and family work. And so I do think there's political momentum behind it. And a part of it is publicizing what other countries have done and what a big payoff there is for doing that. And there's a lot of research, that's aimed at that. I guess I feel like for an academic audience, I'm always trying to recruit people to the research agenda, because I think what's required is actually not, it's not the head of the OECD National Accounts Division who's going to change its mind. What's going to change it is a surge of research and scholarship from junior scholars everywhere, insisting on and documenting this issue. So that's my, that's what I'm trying to organize. That's my kind of, that's my community in a sense, right? But I think there are a lot of opportunities to connect with it and contribute to paid family leave. And early childhood education is another. And the really interesting thing about early childhood education is that southern states, Oklahoma, North Carolina, Georgia, have been kind of in the forefront. And it's this odd, uneven development thing. And, like in Florida, I think your Bright Horizons program is a really interesting kind of historically significant thing. So sometimes unexpected, opportunities, they're never consistent. They're never what you want them to be. They're always kind of stingy. But, in general, we're moving towards much more public support for the development of human capabilities. And the Affordable Care Act is also a part of that, in my view. Let me just see if there's anybody else who has a comment or question. Yeah.
Have you looked at or thought about how non-heterosexual relationships fit into
Yes.
this?
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. The most direct connection is around gay marriage, because, as you know, marriage in the U.S. is an entitlement to some very important economic benefits. And my colleague at UMass, Lee Badgett, who heads up our public policy program there, has been in the forefront of a lot of studies of the economic impact of legalizing gay marriage, and I think has really contributed to that. I think also symbolically what the gay marriage movement has done is it's kind of degendered family values in a way and made it possible to say, look, we can really insist on public recognition and support for family commitments that don't fit the traditional mold, and you should respect that. If you really care about family values, you should respect and support that. And I mean, it's worked. It's not, that fight is not over, and there's still a lot of mean-spirited stuff going on. But I think it vindicates my argument that Americans are really thinking about this issue of how do we support families? How do we redefine family values in ways that are more consistent with changing gender roles and also changing ideas about, heteronormativity? It's part of the same thing. Yeah.
Have you done any work with figuring out the contribution of undocumented workers or people that don't have legal status in the U.S. and how?
Yeah. There's a growing literature looking at migrants, not just undocumented workers, but migrants in general, and they've had it's had some very negative consequences for the U.S., in my view, because it's provided a low-cost source of services for high-income women to meet a lot of their care needs, rendering it less important for them to form alliances with other women for public provision. So a lot of economists say, oh, it's really great because it increases women's labor force participation. And it does. There's studies that show in metropolitan areas where there are a lot of immigrants, highly educated women are more likely to work and work longer hours. I don't think that's a big surprise. And yes, I'm glad that they are able to, I'm not opposed to purchase of care services. I think that enabling increases in women's labor force participation is a good thing, but it's only helping women who have a sufficiently high family income to pay for it, and it's creating another division among women. I mean, I think a lot of these efforts for paid family leave and early childhood education would be much stronger if it weren't for the fact that immigrants have helped prop up the market-based care economy in some negative ways. And this is also very true in Europe. There's a lot of discussion in Europe about the role of care workers, especially for elder care, in Southern Europe in particular. There's a lot of wine to be consumed.
Discussion after.
Yeah, thank you all very much.